am a campus recruiter at MongoDB and a Rutgers alumna. This is Ralph. He also graduated from Rutgers. We are, just want to give you like a little bit of an agenda of the evening. Obviously, Ralph is going to do a awesome and interactive talk. Please get involved. He has stuff to give out. I don't know, at some point he'll explain that. He's going to go through his talk, show you a lot of different MongoDB technologies and kind of how we develop at Mongo. Does everyone know what Mongo is? Okay.
Okay. I'll pull you in the middle anyway.
He'll talk for the bulk of the time. It's really mostly going to be technical. At the end, I'll tell you a little bit about our intern and new grad programs. Obviously, it's that time of year. And we have swag, and then we've already done the pizza. So I think otherwise we're good.
Cool.
Over to Ralph.
All right, ready to go? Hello, everybody. My name is Ralph Capasso. Welcome. Thank you for having me. Nice to meet every one of you, and happy Friday. So, all right, I want you guys all to close your eyes real quick, please. Close your eyes. All right, good. You guys are good. Thank you. And picture this, all right? It's Thursday. You and your friends have just planned the ultimate game tournament for Saturday afternoon. You've been texting back and forth and planning it for weeks. This is everything you ever wanted from college. Everyone will be there. You'll have your favorite games, your favorite snacks, which are Stromboli, Fat Cats, and French fries, of course. And there will be age-appropriate beverages. You literally cannot contain your excitement. Then you have an shnikey moment. You totally forgot it's Parents' Weekend, and your beloved family members are coming to town. They want to know what life is like here at Rutgers, and they expect you to show them around and point out all those legendary Rutgers landmarks. Panic ensues. What are you going to do? Your palms sweat, your heart races. This cannot be happening. Then you have your aha moment, and you say to yourself, what if I create an app to point out all those cool locations? Then not only will I be free from showing my parents around, they will see firsthand the amazing computer science education that I'm getting here at Rutgers. Freedom. But wait, how can I complete this app in such a short time? I can't do it alone. So I want everybody to hold that thought and open your eyes. Now, after that little exercise, you're probably wondering a few things, like who are you? Why are you here? And why are you beating this "are you" thing to death? So a little about me. Again, my name is Ralph Capasso. I'm the lead engineer of the Atlas Enterprise team at MongoDB. So how many of you have heard of MongoDB before? A good amount of you. Cool. Anybody used it at all? All right, good. Some of you. Has anybody heard of MongoDB Atlas at all? Okay, and anybody used MongoDB Atlas? All right, cool. So I'll explain a little bit. For those of you not familiar with MongoDB, very simply, it is a document database. It stores a fancy version of JSON called BSON. We store documents and allow you to easily manipulate and query those documents. It's considered very developer-friendly because it often matches the paradigm of applications much better than your traditional database, which is relational, which is tables that are related to each other, much like a bunch of spreadsheets tied together, to put it very simply. Atlas is MongoDB's database as a service. So with that, you log in with an account, and you can spin up a cluster of MongoDB servers in your favorite cloud provider, so Amazon, Google Cloud, or Azure. We also have a free tier, which you'll see a little bit later, which means you can get started for free and run it for the rest of your life for free. And if you're ready to grow, you can graduate onto something else. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. A little more about me. Prior to joining MongoDB, I spent 16 years at Sony Music Entertainment as a director of supply chain, overseeing their digital asset management and media distribution systems. These systems are responsible for taking audio, video, and graphic media and distributing them to your favorite services, such as Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube, to name a few. In July of 2017, I got this really cool opportunity to come work at MongoDB on the Atlas product, which is one of our fastest growing platforms. It's a really exciting time to be at MongoDB and a really exciting product. So here I am. I just told you about what it is. Now, before all of that, you could actually find me here on the banks of the old Raritan. That's a legit picture of the Raritan of me stumbling back from a football game. Majoring in, of course, as you would think, business management and music. So now you're like, say what? I'll do a little bit of explaining. I took a slightly non-traditional path to get to where I am today. I learned to code at a young age and worked on and off in this chemical company called BASF throughout high school and college. But my first love was always music. So when I graduated, I used my degrees along with my past experience to apply to every record label in New York City. Lucky for me, Sony called, and I got a glorified temp position sitting in a windowless room ripping CDs on the 9th floor of a building for spillover employees. Over time, I scripted a lot of the day-to-day things I did. They took notice and quickly moved me onto a team to code the asset management system that I would later take over. And after that, basically, that led to a lot of sleepless nights of banging my head against the wall, reading tons of code from other people, and then digesting a book I had on Java laying around from high school. So having said that, these days as I interview candidates at Mongo, the majority, if not all, are CS majors, and I have to say they are far more prepared for the real world than I ever was. In fact, one of my most senior engineers on my team is a recent Rutgers graduate. We've had a number of interns. One of you is here in the room, right, I think? So there you are. And new grads. And I have to say, I'm always just impressed with how talented and how sophisticated they are. And many of them do stem from this university. So I'll leave it with you guys are in a very good place. And I think you've all made a really great choice. And for your careers and everything, you'll have no trouble as you move along. So more of why am I here? Well, I love engineering, simply. And I also love the process of engineering. I love to talk about code. I love to talk about technical things. I look forward to engaging all of you. If you have any questions throughout this, feel free to interrupt me. There'll be some stuff which is process-oriented and some stuff in the talk that's going to be technical. I don't know all of your levels. For some of you, this may be very easy. For some of you, it all may be very new. So just interrupt me and ask questions. It'll be interactive as we go throughout. Okay. And the other thing about it is, it takes a very special person to think that a laptop, a cup of coffee, pizza, and a problem is actually a really good time. So, moving right along. MongoDB has a number of core values that we adhere to when we engineer, and this enables us to really create dynamic software that the customer can really relate to, and we do it in a very positive and energetic environment. So those values are think big, go far, make it matter, build together, embrace the power of differences, be intellectually honest, and own what you do. So for today, I really want to focus on this one, which is build together. So for my team, code is a conversation, right? Engineering is an ongoing dialogue. And it doesn't matter on my team whether you've been around in the industry for 20 years or you're just fresh out of college, right? You're expected to be an equal player at all times. And in fact, everybody on the team takes a turn managing an entire project, right? Depending on no matter how much experience you have, sorry. And at any given time during the day, you're going to hear us bouncing ideas off each other. Do you think this should be this way? Would you use this paradigm? What about this package? Hey, I think we should refactor that, right? And that's the kind of environment that lets us build stable software. And in addition to that, everybody owns the solution, right? So we're all in it together. We're always reviewing each other's code. We're always offering support. And we're always trying to find better ways to do things. And like I said, I've been around a long time, and you can ask my new grads. I'm always asking them questions about how to do things better. Okay, so what's the first step? Now back to our exercise from before, right? The first step before we're going to build anything, right, is to identify the problem we're going to solve. So back to the exercise when you had your eyes closed, what was the problem we're trying to solve there?
Trying to create an app in the day.
Right, but why?
Because your parents are coming to town, they want to see everything at Rutgers.
Right, so what is that solving? What would this app solve?
The issue.
It would let us do what?
Satisfying your own happiness and the expectations of your parents.
Right, without you being there, right? So we need to show our families around campus without being there in person. Here, you two are good, so I'm going to throw you. Thank you for being the first ones to jump in. Okay, so that's the key thing, right? Because you can engineer till you're blue in the face all night long, day in and day out, but if you don't actually know what you're trying to solve, you're going to come up with some cool software that does stuff, but you won't quite know what it's for, right? And it might not address the problem. So keep that in mind. The first thing we always do in any engineering thing, whether it's a startup or a very big company, is we always have to identify the problem we're going to solve with the project we're about to embark on, right? The next thing we're going to do is talk about, okay, we know the problem we have to solve, so now we have to talk about the scope. So what are we actually going to do to solve the problem? Now, this isn't technical in saying what technology stack are we going to use or how are we going to do it and all of that. That comes later. The first thing you really need to say to yourself is, what exactly are we going to do to solve this? So anybody have any ideas? Like, what's something we could do to solve this problem?
Would we try to integrate some sort of like a map API?
Okay, good. Yeah, we're going to need a map, right? Very simply put. Maybe I'll draw a little bit for this, right? So yeah, we're going to need a map, we think, right, to show them where things are. Okay, what else? What else might we need to do? Right, we need to know locations that are interesting. Perfect. Any others? Yep.
GPS would be helpful.
GPS is helpful. So we need, you're onto something a little bit more. What would have the GPS built into it? But what has that? What has a GPS? What device do you own that has a GPS? Has to be mobile. You need to have a mobile app, right? Technically. I mean, granted, I'm sure if they had Wi-Fi and they wanted to wander around with a laptop looking ridiculous, it would sort of work too. But let's just say it has to be mobile. Okay, any other things? I'll show you the list that I came up with too, but you guys are on a good track. So we need map, locations, we need mobile. There's one other, let's see. Any other things? Anyone want to elaborate on any of the things? Like maybe some information about locations?
You have to have a way to store the information.
Okay, yeah, we'll need a way to store it, true. That I think will follow more under spec. So we'll hold that thought because we're going to talk about that a bit later. All right, well, let me show you what I came up with on my list of things, which is actually very similar to ours. So we know it's got to be a mobile app or a website, right? We're going to need a map of significant locations near the user, which we talked about. Probably want to display some information about the location, right? Maybe a little more than just a name, but we know we have to display something, right? We can't just put dots, otherwise we don't know what they are. Maybe we want stuff like directions from the current location, and we'll talk about that. Maybe photos, I don't know, any other cool things you could think of that might be fun, maybe not necessary, we'll talk about, and maybe comments, maybe likes, right? So there's one thing I would say with my list. You guys were pretty good, actually. I'll give you good credit for that. You have a very concise list, is you have to be aware of this, right? I call them the scope creep. And it's very common in any systems design, big companies, small startups, or whatever, that you try and do way more than you need to solve the problem. And actually, at some point in the scope, you often grab things that may be useful or may not be useful. So what I like to think that we have to do in the scope is kind of divide things up to things that we consider must-haves and things that are nice-to-haves, right? So I kind of made this list here. Must-haves, we know it has to be mobile app or website. We know we need maps of significant locations near there. We know we have to display something, if at minimum a name, right? Things that might be nice to have might be directions from the current position. If it's close enough, maybe they could figure it out. A link to the website of the location, that could be helpful. Photos, comments, likes, all those might be great, but we don't necessarily need them, right? If the goal is in a short period of time, and we only have a few days to make this, the goal is really just to point out the things. We might not need those to make it successful, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And it seems very simple in this abstract exercise, but as you get into larger scale systems, or you're trying to really solve a problem or be a disruptor of some sort in an industry, you have to be very careful of this kind of stuff, because it really will catch you. It catches us all the time, even at where I am after all these years. Okay. So I like to also say, just take these, and stick them into your phase 2 bucket, right? They're not bad ideas at all, and you may find that they're relevant, but it's good to basically keep them on the back burner. And oftentimes when you start with your must-haves, you'll get feedback from that that will either validate that you wanted something like that, or will go back and tell you, actually, we don't need that. All right, any questions so far on the scoping process? Cool, all right. So moving on, there's actually a term for this, especially when you're building a new product, but we use it even when we're adding on to an existing product. Does anybody know what that term is for that basic thing to solve the problem without maybe all the bells and whistles and everything you can imagine? Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is right, but I heard it's called the MVP, minimal value product.
That's right. You're good. I already gave you a product. I'll give you something else at the end. That's really good. Yes, it's called the minimum viable product. And you'll hear this probably beaten to death in classes. Certainly you hear about it in the startup world, and you definitely hear about it every day at Mongo and other big companies, right? Because we're always looking at when we have to introduce something new to say, what's the minimum viable product, right? This way we don't invest too much time, money, and resources in making something that we don't know whether or not somebody will use or will be useful. Also, in the case of my little example, we're under a lot of time pressure, right? So you try and do too much, you're going to get nothing at the end of the day. Okay, so now we have another couple of things to do. The next step is the spec, right? And we need to decide a couple of things about the spec. Let's categorize them first on the board, then I'll show you what I had. But what are some things now technically with a new app, right? An existing app, you might already have these, but in a new app, we have to kind of decide what technologies we're going to need. So let's categorize the different areas of technology in the stack we need. Anybody know?
If we're making a web app, we need a web development
Right, perfect, yep. I'll just call it UI framework, UX, whatever, but that's perfect, yep. Okay, yep, that's good too. What else?
What about database?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. We're kind of dead in the water without that, and of course, you know, I'm going to be biased about it a little bit more since I'm coming from a database company. Or we could be good at hard coding, but that's a. What else? Anybody? You need something to basically connect this to this, right? So you need some sort of back-end framework that essentially lets the UI communicate with the database.
Can you use like Python, I guess, for that?
You could. We'll get into that in just a second, right? You can use just about anything. There seems to be a million good tools for these kinds of things. There was one more, and then the other one I had on here, anybody could guess, is you're going to need some kind of map framework, which you sort of said with location service, but you're going to need like a mapping framework. So obviously for the exercise today, I'm going to have to pick them because if I had you pick at random, the chances of me actually implementing something useful would probably be slim to none. But if we look at these categories, right, you have all of these. Now the next step would really be to discuss which technologies. So somebody throw out a database name in there.
Mongo.
Right, of course, yeah. You can guess which one I might choose, but throw out some other ones. Like what are some other things? Some other ones out there. Database technologies.
MySQL.
Yeah, MySQL, yep, SQLite, maybe Postgres. Nobody say Oracle. I don't think any startup ever uses Oracle. That's a whole different thing, but this is on video, so I won't comment any further. Okay, great. Anybody have any back-end frameworks they like? Flask, that's a great one. I see that actually come up a lot. Django, yep. Yep, perfect. So we've got a bunch of those. I'll show you the one I picked, but that's the whole, again. So this would be the dialogue we'd have also internally is you guys would all bring these up and we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each, right? Like why go with a relational? Well, everybody uses it. We know a lot of things about it. There's a lot of skill. Why go with Mongo? It's fast. It's easy to use. It's the best thing out there. And then for UI framework, there's a million of these, so give me a bunch of these. Some examples that you guys, what's that? React, yep. Node, yep. Angular, perfect, yep. And these are all good ones to consider, right? And then maybe a mapping API. Who has a good one? We know that one, yep. And then some other ones. So okay, so now let's pretend we had this dialogue. We're going to discuss the pros and cons of each one. That should all be part of your process, right? It should never be just a jump into one. Of course, I'm going to tell you Mongo today, but really you should know why you're picking what you're picking, right? And that doesn't always mean you're picking what you think is the most cutting edge, bleeding edge technology. A lot of times we make decisions on what the engineering staff we're going to hire is going to have as a skill set, right? So there may be the newest, latest thing out there, but you may not actually go with it because you know you can grasp a bunch of developers. And then other times you're going to go with the bleeding edge because it really does solve the problem in a way that cuts development time, makes things more efficient. So in my case, of course, I picked MongoDB Atlas. It's part of the demo today. Backend, I picked MongoDB Stitch. Any of you guys heard of this? So yeah, for those of you that haven't, it's a very cool tool, especially for using MongoDB, but it basically gives you the backend layer for free. So it's a very quick way to launch a backend, so it makes for a very nice demo because I can get it done really quickly. UI framework, somebody said it, is React. Again, there's a lot of good ones. I've done a lot of stuff in Angular. I've done React. I've done a whole bunch of different, we have some backbone stuff and some older things around there, but React is fairly simple to get up and running, and especially for this example, I thought it would be good. For maps, I'm actually going to use OpenStreetMap and Leaflet, and that's simply because I don't want to give Google any money for my demo, and I don't want to have to launch an API key. So that was my laziness about that, and we'll use Leaflet for this. Okay, so now with spec, all right, the next thing we really need to do is kind of discuss a schema, right? Before we can do anything, we got to know what data we're going to store about all this stuff. So let's get to it. What do we need to actually store about a location? What do we need in our database?
Address.
Yeah, maybe an address. Or I think maybe what you're saying is, by address, do you mean actually for display purposes or for actually identifying the point?
Can it be both?
It can be both. Yep. So I'm going to fork that, though, because I think these are fairly significant. Display, and then for actual location. So I'll put coordinates, really, because everything comes down to your latitude, longitude stuff. Coords. All right, what else? Come on, there's some easy ones out there.
Images.
Maybe images. I think images we put in our nice to have bucket, but I'll put I'll put it in there. And images is an interesting one that you bring up. Whether or not to store images in a database, it can be an age-old debate, right? Mongo does have the ability to store files in a database, but oftentimes it's usually better that you kind of store a ref, some kind of URI to a file system for an image in there. But that's debatable. But yes, that's sort of data. If you do store images, you're going to need some way of referencing it. What else?
I'm not sure if this is right in this situation. Like some sort of approximates locations like restaurants or whatnot.
Yeah, so I'm going to put that with addresses. Like if we're putting points of interest, so that's good. Like we'll say, but that could be one of our locations as a restaurant, right? So we'll say that, but for that, again, you need coordinates. That's the key. You can't really plot it on a map if you don't actually know where it is. Yep.
Description.
Yeah, description. There's one other really big one. Tells you exactly what it is. The name. Got to have a name. So I think these are pretty good. You'll see I added one off of our nice to have list. Any other things maybe interesting? I think this kind of gives us a good sense of like, it will show us the point on the map, will tell us what it is, and it will give us a description, right? I think that's pretty good. I think I opted to throw some sugar in my requirements here. So I've named, the type. That was one thing I left off. What is it? Is it an academic building? Is it a restaurant? So you alluded to that in some ways. What is it, right? Categorize it. Description. And then I put a URL in there to the website. That's a nice to have. We don't really have to do that, but it seemed like an easy win. And the coordinates on the map. That's key, right? If we don't know where it is, there's really nothing we can do. OK. So cool. So I'm going to translate that to a simple JSON document, right? So you have name, type, description, URL, and location. Keep your eyes on these as we get into the technical part. This actual structure is going to be fairly relevant. So those of you not familiar with MongoDB, this is exactly what the document looks like in the database. And the advantage of MongoDB is you're generally going to read that back on your app side, and it's already formatted in the way that you want to use it to display it back on the screen very easily. Whereas a relational, you might have to join tables or convert it to JSON in the middle layer. So this makes life a little bit easier, and that's kind of one of the perks of it. So, all right, that's our scoping exercise. Anybody have any questions so far? Cool. Seem good. Some of you probably have some experience with this already, some not. All right, well, it's Halloween, so let's take a candy break. Because before you engineer, you really got to get settled in. The other thing to remember when you're doing all this stuff is take breaks. Because there are definitely times where your eyes will be kind of bleeding out of the sockets, and then you'll go like, it certainly happens to me where like I'll go brush my teeth and then I have an answer. So just take them and pass them around. It does. I can't tell you how many nights I would like sit at my computer trying to solve some problem, tell myself I was going to bed, get halfway to bed, and then decide to go back and fix it. Yeah. There's plenty of science about actually why that happens in the parts of your brain that engage when you switch modes. And these are Skittles. Be careful of allergies. I don't know if anybody has allergies. So the Skittles usually tend to be the most allergy friendly, but here you go. Thank you. How are we on time, Kate? Actually moving pretty quickly. Might be through a lot earlier. So it's cool. All right, how is everybody so far? We're good? All right. I know it's Friday night. You guys are good. You're hanging in.
I'm only going to take one.
You can take more than one. Just finish them. I don't need to bring it back. I got Halloween's coming. I have kids, so there'll be plenty of candy in my house in a short period of time.
It's hard as a guy, but
All right. Shall we? All right, let's get back at it. So let's get coding, right? Here we go. Now for the real stuff, right? That's all that pre-process. At the end of the day, the best part is actually coding something. So let me just pull up some things for myself. All right, first thing we need to do, right? We can't do anything without the database in this case, right? So we're going to start off by launching a database. I'm going to show you how to launch one, but at the end of the day, I already have one up because I don't need us to wait through it. Where are you two? Okay, I'm going to create a project. This is MongoDB Atlas, by the way, the UI. I'm not here to give a total tutorial of MongoDB. I'm just going to give you a bit about it. But we go and build a cluster, right? We're going to go with this M0 tier. Why? Because the price is awesome, because anything for free is good, especially when you're just starting out. So we're going to leave it at that. All we have to do is name our cluster. We're going to call it where are you dev2. Like I said, I already have a database launched because I don't need you to sit through. We'll take about 7 to 10 minutes. I'm going to answer this honestly. I'm really not a robot. So there you go. And our cluster will spin up, and within 7 to 10 minutes we'd have it. But I'm going to take you over here and see what it looks like when it's already launched. What I want to do next is just get you guys some insight into the database. So I'm going to copy this connect string right out of here, and I'm going to open this up in a terminal. So just give me a second to pull a terminal up. And I'll have to increase the font size on here, so hopefully you can read it in a second. Everybody read that okay? Be honest if you can. So maybe we can make it jumbo. I don't know how long. All right. Yep. Let's make sure we can connect through here okay. Come on, you can do it. Take it as you should give it a second. If not, we'll have to go with the other one. Come on. Should connect. I probably should have tested that beforehand. But anyway, so we'll get that connected, and I'll show you in a minute, though. In the meantime, let's get set up to do a data import. So I created this file. I picked a bunch of random locations, not many, but between Cook Douglas, Rutgers College campus, and Bush, and a couple spots on Livingston. So you'll see I noted them here. Very similar to that JSON structure that we had earlier. Okay. And you'll see all of it there. Let's see if we finally got in. No, it doesn't seem to want us to connect. Don't know if we're restricted, so if it doesn't go through, I will connect to my own hotspot. That might help a little bit. So just bear with me. You know if any ports are blocked on this Wi-Fi?
I think all of them are.
All of them? Okay. So I can hotspot. So just if you give me a second, as long as cell servers. This is the point where you talk amongst yourself and have some random banter and have candy, and hopefully my hotspot will take over in just a second. So as you can see, we run on port 27017, which has us in a restricted port. So bear with me. Okay. Come on. There it is. No, I'm just going to go into my personal hotspot. Just take me a minute. Sorry, guys. I'll be on in just a second. All right, let's pick back up. Let's try it one more time. Okay, here we are. So now we're in. Right? Good thing for cell technology. All right, so you're going to see right now I don't have any databases in here. Right, so we have nothing in here. The next thing we need to do is import the data. So I showed you the JSON, the data.json file. So we're just going to grab this Mongo import command, which we can find very easily on our command line tools page, right, which will explain to us very quickly how to pull the data up, right? So we've got Mongo import. If I could type here, let's see. All right, so I've prepped the command already. We're going to run this. I don't know how fast it'll be on the cell phone, but we don't have too many actual things in here. So let's see. Hold on. Let's get out of this. Run it now. Sorry about that. And there we go. We've imported our 18 documents, right? So now if I go back to the shell over here, let's log in. Sorry for the delay. Let's show DBs, right? And then we're going to use where are you? And we're going to do db.locations.find.pretty. All right, cool. So we see them, right? There's our documents. We now have our database. We're sort of ready to go. That's our foundation for everything else we are about to do. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is spin up the React app, right? Or actually, before we even do that, I'm going to show you something else. So now we have our data. The first thing we want to do is actually query our data. So let me bring up and show you guys a query over in this window here. Hold on one second. I apologize. Hang on, I'm sorry. Let me open it. Let's get this window back. Apparently I closed it on you. Here we go. Sorry guys, bear with me 1 second. My apologies. We're back over here. It's going to pull up a new window, and I want to show you. So this is what our query would look like, right? So something that we need to think about. Now, what's one thing you have to consider? You're going to query the database, right, and say, we have all these coordinates. You're going to say, what's near me, right? So what does that mean? What does what's near me mean?
A certain point in a specific radius.
Right. So that's the key, the radius, right? Because if I said states near New Jersey, that's a much different radius than I said restaurants or landmarks near me, right? So we have to come up with a number that we consider kind of relevant for our application, right? And I would say perhaps like the walking distance that you think your parents could make between locations, right? So let's say maybe half a mile or something, right? Maybe that's too much after that. So you've got this parameter here called max distance, right? Which you'll see. Let me shrink this file thing over here so we can see it a little bit more. So we're going to just do a simple query of locations.find, find me all locations near this point and max distance of, it's in meters in Mongo, of 800. Now I'm going to try this, but you're going to see right away that it doesn't work. Now again, I hard-coded coordinates of where I think I'm located, but you'll see that later. We'll do something more specific. But if I do this, it's going to fail, right? Because Mongo doesn't really know that those are coordinates. So you have to do one special step with Mongo and tell it essentially that you are going to query that the data in those location fields is actually location data. So we're going to create this index, right? And it's called create index, and we're going to say location of 2D sphere. And that's going to give us a lot of free things, right? That's going to give us location lookups in the database without doing any additional work. So it's very nice rather than having to write an algorithm. And now if we go back to our query, right, you're going to see a bunch of locations that come up. And we'll make it a little bit prettier, right? And then if let's say I reduce my radius here, and if I can get to it easily from here, I'll do it on the other screen and bring it over. But let's say that we make it 200. I would expect less to no results, right? So let's do that. Okay, and I only get one building there, and then if I go and make it 2,000, I should get a lot more, right? So you get the idea. You're going to set your radius in this query, and for the purpose of our app, we only really have one radius to consider, and that's the one that's going to be in walking distance of our locations, right? Okay, so any questions so far? So we've got a database. We've got a way to look things up, right? So the next thing we want to do is now actually, we need to set up that back end we talked about, right? So how are we going to connect this database to our front end? So before we get into any front end coding, we want to do that connection. So we're going to use Stitch. And I'll show you how to do that really quickly. Let me get back to my clusters here. And we're going to click this link application. Can everybody see this okay? Yep, everybody's still good? All right. So I click link application. I'm going to create a new app, right, with Stitch. So this is really easy. We're just going to call it Where Are You? Or that's fine like that. We're going to keep it, link it to our cluster, and I'm going to hit create, right? So this is going to take me over and create this backend now. It might take a few seconds longer because I'm on a cell phone Wi-Fi connection. Okay, and it's going to bring us to the next console, right? So here, all we're going to do is bind this Stitch application and our services to our database, right? And that's going to allow us from the web client to simply query our database, right? Without having to build another layer or spin up another server and host it on some other solution, right? In this case, I'm going to allow anonymous authentication, and why? We didn't have as a requirement any kind of login, right? So we're not going to track anything about the user. There is data that we want to expose that has no real risk. But I will warn you from an engineering standpoint, you should always be thinking with security in mind, right? You should always have in the back of your mind, am I going to expose anything sensitive? Am I going to expose anything personal, right? It's a real thing, especially in this day and age, that you have to always think about that and protect your data at all costs. In our case, we know we have a locations table. This is all public knowledge. We're not putting our personal opinions about the locations or any history of our even having been there, and we're not storing location data about the user, right? Had we done that, we'd have to be very careful using anonymous authentication that we lock down every collection very specifically. But for the purpose of this exercise, it will be much easier to do it this way. All right, so let's do the database name. We created one called Where Are You? And our collection name is Locations, right? Cool, makes sense? We're good? We got that. Okay, so we're going to add that collection in. Now we've bound our services to the collection. We have to take note of our app ID. I'm going to copy that now and actually put it on a notepad on my side because I'm going to need it in a little while. So we'll do that. And then we have that. And you're going to see what you get next is a bunch of sample code. I have my own versions that we're going to weave into our React app as we go. And then we have these other concepts of services, functions, and values. We're not going to use those right now. But I do want to just set up a collection in here. I just need to go over to rules. You don't have to worry about this too much. We're not going to do a full-blown Stitch tutorial, but I need to give access to read the data. So I'm just going to make a quick role called all. We're not going to give it any kind of delete permissions. We're just going to give it read across the board, and we're going to save it, right? So now we're at a point where we have a database loaded with data that's geo-queryable, and we have a backend that's now accessible, right? So the next step is to set up our front end. Any questions so far on that? How's the pace? Are we too fast, too slow? We're good. Like, again, the idea should be that you can set this up quickly because, again, the problem we're solving, we have 2 days to do it. So, okay. So now I'm going to just go into my workspace folder here, and we're going to create a new project. I'm using a nice little script called create React app, which is great. I'm going to call it where are you to because I actually have one already created so we don't have to sit here and watch it download NPM modules all night. But you get the idea. We click that. That's going to create our project for us, fetch all the data, and put it in and get it set up, right? So I'm going to abort this one. Like I said, I already have one set up for you. So now you'll see here, I'm going to go back to open our app.js file, and now we've got a very simple thing here. I'm going to launch it. Right? We're going to start this up. It's going to give us a nice little local web server, and you'll be able to see our app as it starts out of the box. Here it is on port 3000. Like I said, it might be a little slow with my connection here, but it should spin up in just a second. We'll give it a minute. There you go, right? So now we have a React app. Let's open up the console a bit here because we're going to want to read some debug information out as we start to build. Okay, and let's get our IDE open again here. Let me just drag this back this way. Okay, we can minimize the deck for now. Okay, cool. So now we have some side-by-side things. The nice part about this is we can easily make changes, and they'll be reflected immediately once we save, right? You'll see it right in there. So we've got a nice little framework, and the next thing we want to do is now we basically have to, let's do something really simple. Let's just set the title, make it a little prettier. Otherwise it will bother me that it says React the whole time. So I'm just going to go in here, update our little title, do one cosmetic thing here. There we go. It says, where are you? Back to here. So now what I want to do is connect the front end to Stitch, right? Because that's our gap right now. We have a front end, we have a back end service connected to the database. We have to connect to the front end, right? So in order to do that, we're going to need to actually install the Stitch SDK for JavaScript. So we're going to go back to our terminal, open a new tab, right? Okay, we're just going to run this. This actually shouldn't take very long, even over a cellular connection. It's fairly light. So we're going to let that run, and that's going to give us access to all of the Stitch modules we need to actually run the application. So we'll just give that a split second to install. Okay, great. So now we have our Stitch SDK. And the next thing we need to do is actually give our component here a reference to it. So let's import those modules, right? Not that, but this. Pardon me, I'm toggling between, maybe I should have mirrored. Here we go. Cool. So now we've imported these modules and we have access to them, right? So the next thing we have to do is actually set up the client so we can query the database. So we do that by declaring the client up top outside the component here, right? Now we have our client. And a lot of this is a bit of boilerplate, right? So we're just going to set up our DB reference over here. I'm going to do it up top. There are definitely other locations you could do this in, but we're up and running. Let me make sure I have the right app ID also. I think this is the right app ID, but if we don't connect, we'll know right away. Okay, so now we have that. So we've got access to the client. We've got access to the DB. There's one other thing I want to interject here real quick. There's some things we're going to want to keep track of. Is everybody familiar in React with how state works in a component? Okay, so for those of you who are not, you can keep track of things within a component. There are multiple ways to get data into a component, but the two most common without using this thing called Redux are to use the state and to use props, right? So props would be when you instantiate a component, you pass in some data that is controlled and owned by the component that's calling it, and state is within the component. If you want to keep track of some behavior in the component relative to that instance of the component, you put it in the state. So I'm going to declare some state stuff, which to you right now is not actually going to look all that relevant. I have to put it actually in a constructor. So let me see if hopefully I do this right. Right, and then I'm going to stick in the state. Oh, sorry. Super. I believe that's it. There we go. So now we have a state. Now don't worry about these. These will become relevant as we go along through the exercise, but this is going to keep track of where we are. I actually don't think we're going to need this one for today. But we'll come back to what the relevance is of those later. Okay, so now here's a good question to keep in mind. What's the next thing we have to do? How are we actually going to talk to the database? Well, we have to connect to it, right? But what's one thing you want to be really mindful of when you're connecting to a database in a web app, right? What is it? Anybody have any ideas? Or with any resource that you have to be careful of, right?
My guess will be compatibility between the two.
That's one thing, for sure.
Security.
Security is another. Luckily, in our case, we're doing very public data, which is good. Also, how about like resources and using things? We want to make sure that we don't create a connection to the database repeatedly if we already have one, right? So there's lots of things to think about when you keep in mind, like if we should create it once when the component loads, and then we can use that connection throughout, right? As opposed to, let's say, every time the page rendered, we created a new database thing if we're just changing a field that doesn't require data access. And the same thing goes for when you're querying data as well, right? You want to be very careful. When you have an app with 5 users, it generally doesn't matter and you'll never notice it. But what happens is you scale to 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000. These little tiny resource things become extremely critical, right? And they become extremely expensive. So you want to always be mindful that we connect just at the right amount of time and that we query just at the right opportune time. So there's a function in React for a component called component_did_mount. And I'm going to call basically our connection to the database, right? Can everybody read this okay? Is that okay? Can you guys see it all right? So there's this component_did_mount, and we're going to actually log in. Again, we're doing anonymous login here. We're going to have it log into the database just once. Let me format real quick, make it a little cleaner. And now if we go back to our React app over here, right, in the console, let me see if I can blow this up. Hopefully, we should be able to see in the console that we've connected, but let's see if it came through or not. Go to this view of it. Give me a second. Don't worry about the DB not used. We're going to use that a little bit later. All right, well, at any rate, we'll keep going, but we should see, yeah, here we go, authenticated with MongoDB Stitch, right? And you might notice I captured one other thing at the state here, and this is just to track whether or not we're authenticated. This will be relevant later. The reason I put it in is you can avoid errors of things. If you know you're not authenticated to the database, you shouldn't try and query it and things like that. It will just prevent errors for your client and things. But as such, you notice now we're connecting just once, right? When the component mounts, we're going to connect. In the case of Stitch, we don't have a cleanup, but also some resources, as you'll see later, you might instantiate them, but you need to clean them up at the end. So be mindful of that at all times too. So okay, so now we know we can connect to Stitch. We're going to have access to our data. Okay, so somebody mentioned earlier, what's one of the most important things we're going to need now that we know we can query the database? Before we can query the database, what do we need to give the database to tell us what's around us? Our location. So we're going to have to tap into the browser's geo services. So let's take a look at one way to do this. Let's go back and we'll grab the position in, we'll grab the position right now when the component mounts, right? So let's see what happens. Now, keep in mind, one thing I didn't do very much with this is I'm not testing if the browser has compatibility for geolocation. It just takes too much time for the demo, but something you'd want to do is make sure your browser actually supports it and give a relevant error message if it doesn't. So what you'll see here is I've got the current position. Now, this is great. We can query the database. What's the one problem with this, with the way I did it? What's one thing about it that's not so great? Yeah?
You weren't asking for position.
That's the browser will actually do that. It would have done that had I not accepted it yesterday. But that's a good catch. Good question though. But what about this particular thing? We load the component, we connect to the database, and we get the position. What's lacking? What is an action your user might take that this might become somewhat of a problem?
Like if they move around.
Right. If they move, this isn't going to update until I go and reload the page. And that seems kind of like a deal breaker, right? Because it's kind of annoying, and it's also, let's face it, if we're considering it's our family members, not everybody's that computer savvy. The idea that they have to hit a reload button on a mobile browser seems crazy, right? So that's something you have to keep in mind as well. So the way we'll do that is actually geolocation nicely has a feature for watching built in natively, right? And we're going to paste this in, right? And we're going to create this thing called a watch ID. And that's just by calling the same exact thing but called watch position. And all this does is says when the person moves, right, fire an event. That's it, and tell us where they are. So you'll see for this, it's essentially exactly the same. We get the current position. But now if I go over here, this might get a little bit jammed in. Let's go to sensors. And let's say I take myself to Berlin for a minute. It's hard to see here, but you'll see our coordinates get updated, right? So now we know when the user moves, it's going to gracefully fire off events, and we're going to be in good shape. So does that make sense? Now back to my other point of cleanup. Geolocation actually should be cleaned up. So we'll look at this, the antithesis of component will mount. We've got component will unmount, and I'm going to capture the watch ID here so that we can tell the geo thing when we stop using this component to stop watching. Why is this important? Well, if you're navigating around your app and someone, let's say, goes to a page that's static data, there's no reason for their thing to be pulling the location in the background. When they return to that view or that part of your app, let the watcher start back up and get the location. It saves us a lot of overhead, and you're going to see, because we're querying data, it'll reduce the amount of service requests we have to make to actually get back the location to get back where we are. And again, when you have 5 users, probably not relevant. When you have 1 million users, very relevant. You pay for all of this stuff. So just keep that in mind. I thought that would be a good example to share there. So any questions so far? So we're making pretty good progress, right? Like we're logged in. We're now watching the user's location. We're moving around. We're cleaning up resources. We feel pretty good about ourselves. We had candy. We're all pretty happy, right? So, okay. So now what I want to do is reflect some of what we're learning on the display itself, right? So before we get into mapping, let's just go here. I'm going to erase a bunch of this stuff, replace it with some other code, just so you can see. So we've got this standard header stuff. I'm just going to take this out for now. Right, this app won't win any design awards, but it doesn't matter because you'll get to play games and hang out. Hold on, I over deleted here. Let me go here. I think I just have an extra div tag. Okay, cool. So you're going to see here, I have to just take this out of here. Just doing copy and paste in one thing. So in the render method, we're going to call our locations and positions from the state. And actually, I did miss a step. I apologize. One thing I forgot, I can't give you locations and position if I don't actually save this stuff. So let's do this. We have to create a function. So back here, sorry, reversing a little bit. Now we're watching the position, right? And when the position goes off, we're firing a console log. But we're actually going to need to now, once we have this, find the locations, right? So once we have all the info we need, I'm going to make a little function inside that says find locations. We're going to give it the position. Right, we'll log out the position again. Don't mind my N key, it's busted on my laptop. Just so we have it. Okay, so that's going to we'll fire off this function, and then one of the things we want to do is actually query the database. So what I'm going to do here is just make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that if we are not authenticated, so we're going to do const auth. We're going to pull that out of the state, right? And then we're just going to say, if we're not auth, let's just get out of here and not do anything, because I don't think it's going to provide us any value. And now we're going to query the database, right? So remember the query we made earlier. I'm going to show you the Stitch version of it, which looks remarkably like the other one. What are we complaining about here? Thank you. So this funny thing, my N key on my laptop is broken. So you'll see it either misses the N or puts 2 of them. It rarely seems to get 1. Okay, so let's format a little bit here. Okay, so now you'll see here, we've got a query, and then what that does, it creates a promise, and when we get locations, we'll have them here, and we can now set them in the state, right? So let's see how we're looking on the app itself. We should get in a second. It's going to be a little bit slow because I think of the mobile connection to get over to Stitch, but this will basically fire off, run our geo query, which again we've hard-coded with 800 meters, about half a mile. Another thing you should know is my error handling is not particularly elegant here. In the real world, you should do something better than console logging the error. Of course, for the sake of time here, we're not going to do that. So okay, so now you see we've got this function. We've set it up. One thing I forgot to do here is instead of console logging here, we now want to call our little function and pass in the position, right? So let's add that in. Right, put it here, and let's see if it fires off. Okay, now we haven't found anything, and that's okay, because it could be because of where our location is set. I believe I left us in Berlin. So let's go back, grab the sensors and see where we are. Yep, let's put no override and see if it gives us anything. And there you go, right? So here we go. Now we know we're finding a bunch of locations, and here, very crudely, I've spit them out. I thought I had something to echo our position in the UI. Let me check that. So we can also do a quick, yeah, okay. So here we have position. Should be showing position, but that's a different thing. We'll come back to that. So at any rate, you see we're querying based on where we are. We now have a bunch of locations that seem fairly relevant, right? Hill Center, where we are, Werblin, High Point Stadium, LSM, and the apartments, right? So cool. I think I have a duplicate data record in there, but that's okay. Okay, so you get the idea. Now we're connected to, now we have the front end connecting to the back end, querying based on location. We're in pretty good shape. The next thing we need to do, right, is add arguably the most fun part of the whole thing, right? And that is what? The map, right? Because that's going to make it actually fairly worthwhile. So we're going to do a quick npm install back on our project, and we're going to install Leaflet and React Leaflet. So this will just take a second. As I said, these are open libraries. You're always going to debate whether to build or to use things. If there are common components that do what you do well, and especially if you're under time pressure, I would recommend trying them at least, and using them rather than thinking to build from scratch. They'll get you off the ground much better. So here you go. We've got our React Leaflet stuff in. So now we're going to put some stuff in place for that. Don't mind, a lot of this code is kind of boilerplate workaround for that, for Leaflet. So I'll put this in and won't bore you with the details of discovering it. Just make life a little easier for all of us. Let's go up here. I'm going to expand just a little bit wider. Okay, we're going to go up here, set up some stuff for Leaflet. Compile over. Okay, good. So now we've got that. Now, we need to actually take the data, right? We're going to have to feed the map our position, right? So the other thing we need to do is translate the data to make sure it's in the right format that the mapping software can actually take. So let's go over to our render method. It's going to declare another constant here. We're going to call it map center position, right? And all this is saying is if we have a position, then the coordinates are going to be a simple array of latitude and longitude, right? So very easy. And now we get to do the fun part. We're going to add some map stuff in. So let's go back, go up to the top. We're going to take out our logo SVG because we're not using that anymore. So here you see a bunch of stuff in the React Leaflet package. And those of you not familiar with React, don't worry. The idea really is that we're importing a bunch of modules, making a bunch of references, and then calling them. All the frameworks are fairly similar in that sort of concept at the very least. So all right, so let's stick our map in here and see what happens. Now something I know off the bat, it's not quite going to look so good when we first start, right? So let's look and see what happens when we get it. Or it's not going to appear at all, which I'll show you. So one of the things you need to do is make sure you've set up your styling appropriately for the map. So let's go over again. I'm going to go add a little CSS class to put the box in for the map. We're going to add the leaflet CSS first. I'm going to import that up here. Okay. Pardon me a second. And now we'll add some sizing to our app CSS, and this should get us our map. All right, let's see. Let's hope for the best here. I don't know how fast it's all going to be given my mobile connection, but we'll try it. Let's reload. Come on. Just bear with me a second. We'll see what's going on with our map. All right, I'm going to give it a second. We'll keep moving while we're going here. Let's see. I apologize. The map is back. Okay, sorry about that, guys. I'm not sure exactly where I went wrong there, but at any rate, you can see that we have a map. So what I did is we imported the component through React Leaflet. Right, and we've added the map here as a component. It has some properties on it. Again, we have to tell it where we are because we're the center of the universe in this app and everything's relative to us, so we give it the map center position. Then I wanted to put a marker on it that sort of said where we are, right? So just to show you, you are here, and then you're going to want to mark all those locations, right? So I meant to build this a little more incrementally, but obviously with my technical difficulties, I had to kind of revert to something I knew would actually display. So back to that. Lesson number 1, always bring screenshots. So here we go. So any questions on this? So now that we've connected everything, we know we load the data. Again, we can finally display it, and we're using this pre-existing map component, put the map in, and set some markers on the map. So as you can see here, we have this, and then what should happen is I'll go back to our sensors over here. We're obviously not going to take ourselves to Berlin this time. But let's pretend we move to another campus. I have some other fun kind of locations on there. So here's a custom location in Berlin. There we are in Berlin, I guess, or wherever it left off. But let me grab some other coordinates for you. Maybe we'll take a walk over to College Ave for a second. Here we go. That in there. Go over and grab this one. Put it in, and now you'll see we're on College Ave, right? There's Bucolic Park, and here's some other points of interest from our map. Here's the Student Center. We've got the Olive Branch. It says, I study there, Mom, I promise. Stuff Your Face, and some other landmarks, right? So again, we fed it, it's reading our data, it's now putting it on the map. We're free to walk around, and as we move around, it's going to change locations, right? So that essentially ties everything together, right, and builds our app. So in review, or just in summary, again, we had a problem to solve. We figured out what exactly we needed to solve. We limited the scope to exactly what we needed to solve the problem. And then we were able to pick our tech stack and to figure out what technologies we're going to use, and then we stitched them together. Now, of course, the theme is build together, so what you saw here was basically me dictating it, but the idea is that as we build that, we'd be having a dialogue. Also, we'd be able to divide that up amongst each other and do it in smaller parts and smaller tasks, right? So the real theme is to make sure that you keep the code conversation going on so that you pick the right things and that you can implement them. A little harder for me to totally build this interactively here. I ask questions along the way to kind of simulate the idea of the thought that I would look for from you. But if we were in a real project, we'd be talking about this all day long, right? Somebody would plot the map and say, hey, you gave a blue marker for the person. Maybe it should be a person. Let's use this. Or what happens when they overlap? And you can imagine some other things here. And then from using it, you'd kind of derive some feedback and work off of that. Any questions?
Wait, how long does the process usually take for a project?
It depends on the size, right? Most times if we're actually going down the scope spec process, it can be anywhere from a week to a month to a quarter, right? It really depends on the scale of the feature that we're building. Something really cool, as I mentioned earlier, is everybody takes a turn managing projects. One fun thing, I'll just note on the side, interns, for instance, in Mongo, it's a little different. They do real work, right? So some of the biggest features we have in Atlas were actually written by interns. we have this very cool feature. I showed you the free tier, right? So it's a free cluster. Well, when you're ready to move to a paid cluster, there's a process. You click a few buttons and it magically takes it off to a new architecture moves. That's completely built by our intern team. And this summer, our intern team built out another set of encryption features, right, for the customer. So that's one really cool thing, and you get a sense of that build together feel as we really expect you to kind of be a part of it from the minute you walk in the door. But yeah, they all vary, and it all depends. In a larger company, generally, since it's not a startup, you're the one that's picking the things, right? You're not the one picking all the projects. So you have a product team that's kind of figuring out with the customers what the most relevant features are, and you're part of that. Like the leads are kind of part of that conversation early on, and then we all plan it out together. Something interesting with that too is we have a process where once we have a list of things from the product team that they're targeting in a quarter, all engineers go in a room, not just the leads, and we draw out all the requirements on the board and we give them sizings, like t-shirt sizes and things, and we try and figure out how long each thing will take and how much we can fit. Questions? Okay, cool. Well, you guys have been a wonderful audience. It's great to meet you. I'm really happy to have you. Sorry for the little technical blip in there. Again, there's more time for Q&A if you have any questions, but I'll be here afterwards for a little bit. Let me know. Please do apply to our intern program. It is really fun. We get to interact a lot together, and I look forward to working with any of you. Thank you.